and welcome to the program. Georgia is currently going through a massive political turmoil after the speech of a Russian MP brought thousands of protesters into the streets of the capital, Tbilisi. Following scuffles between the protesters and the police, violence escalated in recent weeks, putting Georgia's ruling party on the brink of a historical crisis. Joining me in our studio today for an in-depth understanding of the situation is Andreas Umland. He's a political scientist and historian. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
First question, just in general for the viewers to understand what's happening in Georgia right now. Recently, for an interview for RFRL, Thomas de Valles, and your fellow at Carnegie Europe, said it was, quote, an accident waiting to happen. What's your stance on that quote?
Yes, that's how I see it as well. These conflicts in Transnistria and South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and also partly in Ukraine. These are so-called frozen conflicts, and it's quite natural for them that they, from time to time, they then break out again and they come to the surface again. Something like that goes also for Nagorno-Karabakh, and that indicates that these territorial issues that the various countries have need to be solved, and they cannot be left on their own. In Ukraine, we have permanent war here. But in these other areas, there is always an escalation possible too. Is
it only about the territorial conflict? Because this analyst also says, and also said that there is also this kind of feeling that the ruling party, Georgian Dream, is kind of out of touch with the Georgian population. What's your thought about it? Yes, that is an additional factor, and I'm frankly surprised that there is so much misunderstanding on the side of the currently ruling elites in Georgia. Without the Russian factor, though, I would say that the sort of change of government and change of ruling parties would be something more natural and wouldn't be fraught with such risks as we have now. And in Ukraine, one could also observe something like that, that there is a lot of mistrust, there's a lot of discussion about possible Russian involvement in domestic affairs. And these conflicts, they poison in general the domestic political confrontations that are natural by themselves. Obviously, the opposition will always be critical of the government, and then they will change each other. But because of the Russian factor and the deep distrust that the different parties have for each other, they tend then to escalate and produce these kind of uprisings.
I want to tell the European leaders to come and look at this new Georgia and find answers how we should fight against Russia's soft power. Here, after one more fight, the Georgian people have demonstrated that Russia will not win. But everyone should watch and learn how we defend our dignity and statehood. I love you and I am proud of you. I will stand with you until we win.
Well, that was actually the leader of the opposition right there. Would you say that the Georgia Dream Party, as he has been accused of, is too smooth with Russia?
Yes, that is the accusation. In other circumstances, if there had been no such more basic conflict with Russia about South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that would be something that could be discussed, the exact policies, the diplomacy, the kind of approach one should take to neighbors. That would be something discussed in TV shows, in the parliament and so on, and not on the streets. But because of these territorial conflicts and the sheer fear that the people have, then this leads to these sort of street fights and manifestations. And I think that is also something that Russia wants, to create this constant feeling of insecurity.
So this instability also plays in the hand of Russia in a way?
Yes, I would say so, and it creates also wariness on the side of the West. Many Westerners do misunderstand the situation. They think these countries are by themselves somehow unstable and unreliable and have no civilized form of conflict. Conflictual conduct. Something like that goes also for Ukraine, and that is an impression that Russia certainly wants to create.
So you would say that the scenario could repeat the scenario which is happening in Georgia now, because the idea of a speaker, of a Russian MP sitting down on the seat of the spokesperson of the, let's say, parliament or Verkhovna Rada, we could hardly see that in Ukraine. Would you say that the same kind of thing could happen around here?
Well, now it cannot happen here, but until 2014 there were also these Russian delegations and all these connections, especially that the Party of Regents had to Russia. That was something that would have been also a sort of, that does not need to be something unnatural and principally poisonous, but in these circumstances when Russia is obviously not satisfied with the current status quo, it wants to change the status quo, it wants to influence countries like Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova. That is then always much more conflictual than it would otherwise be.
Now, in this, it's not only a domestic issue here, because also Russia is also trying to squeeze Georgia by banning some flights from Russia, by having putting some pressure on its economy. Do you think it's really efficient? Do you think Georgia is that dependent of the Russian economy, as well as for Ukraine or all the other countries around? How hard is it to get out of this influence?
Well, Georgia, like Ukraine, or even more so than Ukraine, is not a particularly rich country. It doesn't have the same kind of resources. It doesn't have the same kind of sort of free way to behave itself, because that Russia has, because it has these natural resources. So these countries are actually dependent to a certain degree, and the most effective sanctions that were actually ever introduced against Russia were also in the reverse side, the Ukrainian sanctions that were imposed after the annexation of Crimea. So there's a mutual interdependence, but at the end of the day, Russia has, of course, a larger leverage here.
Now, so as said before, the ruling party proposed a new reform to have a proportional vote and proportional representation at the parliament. Would you say it's going to be enough to calm the unrest?
Well, this is maybe something that will then be sufficient for the political leaders. That's very difficult to say. I would suspect that this is a rather technical question. It may not be sufficient. It is, of course, important. And here in Ukraine, we have actually a somewhat similar discussion about the single-member districts. But you know, I'm more ambivalent about these sort of electoral rules, because when you introduce one electoral rule, you lose the advantages of the other electoral rule. Of course, single-member districts have also their advantages. So I would think that this will be insufficient to solve the conflict.
Now again, about the protesters themselves, I read recently in an article that the protests have quickly developed into a double crisis, quote, pitting Moscow against Tbilisi and pitting the protesters in Georgia against their own government. How do you see this apparent dilemma going? Do you see it uniting at one point? Do you see a real uprising here?
No, I don't think there will be something like an uprising like the Rose Revolution in 2003. I would rather think that this will be just somewhat sharper conflict than it would be without the Russian involvement. As I said before, these sort of confrontations between the government and the opposition are in a way natural, and they can also include foreign policy issues, but because Russia is a sort of untraditional foreign policy issue, it then has this additional meaning.
Now, what's interesting here, it's also the involvement of the citizens into their life, into the life of the parliament, and it's in a way some sort of democratic process, like we saw in Ukraine with Mr. Zelensky's election. You yourself are behind a system called Pro-Viber. Can you tell us more about this system?
Well, I'm currently involved here as an advisor in a project by the Committee of Voters of Ukraine that is trying to introduce a voting advice application, which is called Pro-Vybor, for elections. This is a game, basically, that one can play on the computer or on the telephone, and one can then make statements or take a position concerning certain political statements, and then at the end compare how close one's positions are to the positions of certain parties. Something like this has been already tried during the presidential elections. There was a similar game here that was available already for the presidential candidates called iVote, and also some other similar voting advice applications. This additional voting advice applications that currently the Committee of Voters is introducing, ProViber, its name, is developed with a more sophisticated, I would say, methodology, in that in the development of the statements to which the parties have to take a position, and on which then also the voters take positions in the development of these statements, young people are involved, and this is somewhat following the German model of the so-called Wahlomat. That's the name of the major German voting advice application, which was originally developed to involve young people into elections and to have them more interested in somewhat boring political issues, and also to refocus a little bit the electorate's attention away from how a politician looks, or what an image of the party is, or how hip somebody is, or something like that, but to refocus on the real substantial issues, and also to explain to people who wouldn't otherwise read party programs what are actually the ideological, the programmatic differences between different parties. In Western Europe, maybe less so in Ukraine, although I see that partly here in Ukraine as well, we have often the problem that the parties become undistinguishable for the ordinary voter, and these voting advice applications, they help people to actually distinguish parties from each other and to see the differences. And these voting advice applications usually focus on only those issues that are controversial between the parties. And much of the programs of many modern political parties, and this is also to a certain degree true for Ukraine, where, let's say, the national democratic parties are very similar, much of the programs are, of course, almost congruent. They say the same. And these voting advice applications, they help voters in a playful way to distinguish different parties from each other, and then to come to a more rational, if you like, conclusion about what might be their best choice.
Could it be used in a certain reverse way, that let's say the most voters are attracted to certain ideas and stuff like that? Could it work as, let's say, a reverse kind of referendum for parties, and say to let's say the party sees those polls and say, like, maybe we should focus on that, or that politics, maybe to attract more people?
Yes, one of the purposes of this particular methodology that the Committee of Voters has been using with ProViber is that they've invited young people who then also have their impact in, and we are, or the Committee of Voters has then sent these statements to the parties. Unfortunately, the parties have not responded as much as they should have to the sort of questions by the young voters. But indeed, one of the functions of these voting advice applications is also to make the parties aware what is important for the voters, and what is actually sort of salient, what is in the air, and what especially young voters expect from parties, what kind of answers the parties expect. And this is a very good instrument to then avoid these sort of street conflicts that one may otherwise get into, so that actually elections fulfill their function. People make informed choices and are not choosing somebody about whom they will later be disappointed because they had no time or no nerves to read actually the party program.
Now, and to conclude this interview, this also goes in the line that President Zelensky has talked about, which is state in a smartphone, in a way. Would you say that this way of, let's say, putting politics in a smartphone, in apps, in games and things like that, e-politics, let's say, can actually help Ukraine fight its core demons, like corruption, like, a certain form of transparency?
Yes, this is an instrument of transparency, because it translates boring party programs into sort of playful games where young people can sort of also give different answers and then see what comes out of it, and have then actually a better understanding what stands behind the parties. I think it fits very well into this, and this is a big challenge in this complicated sort of more advanced world we are living in, where it's not any longer clear who is right, who is on the right, who is on the left, who is actually having which program. These sort of things need to be more done, and technology, I think, can play here a useful role. In the past, we have mainly seen, let's say, in relation to the 2016 US presidential elections, in which harmful ways these new technologies can be used, but they can be also made useful, like in this voting advice application, ProViber or iVote, or in others, to bring people and politicians closer together, and not to falsify, but to activate the political process.
Well, thank you very much for this overview and to explain this project to us in UATV. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio today.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was Andreas Umland, political scientist and historian, talking about the current situation in Georgia and the project ProViber. Thank you for watching the program and stay tuned for the rest.